On the morning of March 12, 1883, in the basement archives of the New York Department of Public Works, a surveyor named Thomas Aldrich opened a leather portfolio that had been mislabeled in the 1879 catalog reorganization. The inventory card identified it as containing sewer expansion proposals for the Lower East Side, routine infrastructure planning that should have held nothing but technical drawings and cost estimates. Inside, Aldrich found something else entirely: a series of albumen prints showing ornamental plasterwork, carved stone medallions, and decorative iron grillwork, photographed in spaces that, according to every official map and construction record, existed 15 feet below street level in locations where no such embellishment should have been possible. The photographs were dated, stamped, and annotated in a clerk's precise hand. Each showed elaborate architectural details captured in the harsh magnesium flash typical of early underground photography. The contradiction was immediate and absolute. Sewer tunnels did not feature carved rosettes. Drainage channels did not include plastered ceiling vaults. Yet the images showed exactly that. Documented with the clinical precision of municipal photography, filed among documents that suggested nothing extraordinary at all. The portfolio contained 23 photographs in total. Each was mounted on thick cardstock, numbered sequentially, and annotated with coordinates that corresponded to intersections beneath Canal Street, Chambers Street, and Worth Street. The handwriting matched that of James Kirkwood, the chief engineer of the city's Water Commission from 1879 to 1882, a man known for obsessive documentation and meticulous record-keeping. In the lower right corner of each photograph, barely visible in faded pencil, appeared a second set of notations, measurements in feet and inches, followed by abbreviations that meant nothing to Aldrich. The official ledger for that month made no mention of Kirkwood's photographic survey. The budget record showed no expenditure for magnesium powder, glass plates, or developing chemicals. A marginal note in a different hand, added sometime later, stated simply, "Transferred to general storage, April 1883. No further action required." The photographs had been filed, forgotten, and effectively erased from the administrative memory of the department. Aldrich copied the coordinates onto a separate sheet of paper. That afternoon, he cross-referenced them against the master drainage maps maintained in the engineering office on the 4th floor. The locations aligned precisely with primary trunk sewers completed between 1865 and 1871. Part of the massive subterranean expansion that followed the Metropolitan Board of Health's condemnation of the old cesspool system. These were supposed to be purely functional spaces, brick-lined channels with arched ceilings, designed for flow capacity and structural integrity, nothing more. The engineering specifications, preserved in bound volumes that smelled of linseed oil and mildew, made no reference to decorative elements. Material lists included only Baltimore brick, Portland cement, cast iron pipe, and timber shoring. Time equals 400 milliseconds / greater than no plaster, no ornamental stone, no wrought iron grillwork of the type visible in Kirkwood's photographs. On March 19, 1883, Aldrich descended into the Canal Street trunk sewer through a maintenance access shaft near Broadway. He carried a calcium light lantern, a tape measure, and copies of 3 photographs from the portfolio. The air was cool and heavy with moisture, smelling of wet brick and the faint mineral tang of groundwater seeping through mortar joints. The tunnel stretched in both directions, its arched ceiling rising 9 feet above the invert channel, where a thin stream of runoff moved sluggishly toward the Hudson. The brickwork was precisely as specified, utilitarian, repetitive, showing the wear of a decade's service. Time equals 500 milliseconds / no ornamentation, no carved details. Aldrich walked north for 200 feet, his footsteps echoing flatly against the curved walls. The lantern threw harsh shadows that made the mortar lines seem to shift and waver. He found nothing that matched the photographs, except, at a junction where a smaller lateral sewer entered from the east, there was a discrepancy. The junction vault was larger than necessary, its ceiling rising an additional 3 feet to accommodate what appeared to be a structural reinforcement, a series of concentric brick rings that formed a shallow dome. The pattern was unusual, too regular and too deliberate to be merely functional. Aldrich held the lantern close to the cool surface. The bricks were the same red Baltimore clay as the rest of the tunnel, but their arrangement created a radiating design, almost floral in its geometry. He placed his hand against the surface and felt something unexpected. shallow grooves between certain courses, as if the bricks had been set to create intentional channels or recesses. In the photograph from Kirkwood's portfolio, this same junction appeared, but the image showed something more, plaster filling those recesses, painted white, transforming the brick pattern into a raised relief of overlapping petals or leaves. Aldrich ran his fingers along the grooves. They were packed with silt and calcium deposits, hardened into a cement-like mass that obscured whatever had once filled them. Time equals 600 milliseconds slash. He scraped at one recess with the blade of his penknife. Beneath the mineral crust, he found a thin layer of gypsum plaster, gray with age and moisture, but unmistakably intentional. The official record stated that this junction was completed in October 1868. The photograph in his hand was dated April 1880, more than a decade later. Either the plasterwork had been added after construction, or it had existed all along and been systematically removed between 1880 and 1883. Both possibilities contradicted the department's own documentation. The engineering logs made no mention of secondary finishing work. The maintenance records showed no demolition, no alteration, no reason for ornamental elements to appear and then vanish. In a second photograph from the portfolio, Kirkwood had captured a section of tunnel wall near Chambers Street that showed a series of iron brackets mounted at regular intervals, perhaps every 10 feet, each supporting what appeared to be a glass globe or lantern housing. The brackets were ornate, cast in a Victorian style with scrollwork and acanthus leaf details wholly out of character for municipal infrastructure. Aldrich knew that the city's underground spaces were lit, when necessary, by temporary calcium lamps or, in some of the newer sections, by experimental Edison electric fixtures installed in plain ceramic sockets. Decorative lantern brackets made no sense, yet the photograph showed them clearly. And the image quality, the sharpness of focus, the evenness of exposure suggested no manipulation or double exposure. Kirkwood had photographed something real. On April 3, 1883, Aldrich returned to the archives and requested the complete file of Kirkwood's official correspondence from 1879 to 1882. The clerk, a young man named Brennan, who treated the filing system with quasi-religious reverence, brought a single folio box containing 47 letters, memoranda, and technical reports. Aldrich read through them methodically. Most concerned routine matters: budget requests, personnel disputes, delivery schedules for cast iron pipe. 3 letters, however, stood out. The first, dated November 1879, was addressed to the Board of Commissioners and requested authorization for a comprehensive photographic survey of existing subterranean infrastructure to establish baseline documentation for future maintenance and expansion planning. The request was approved without discussion, as noted in the meeting minutes stapled to the letter. The second letter, dated February 1880, was a terse directive from the board to Kirkwood, instructing him to confine all photographic documentation to structural elements directly relevant to flow capacity and structural integrity, omitting any extraneous features. The language was oddly specific, as if responding to something Kirkwood had documented that the board found problematic. The third letter, dated March 1882, was Kirkwood's resignation, submitted without explanation and accepted immediately. Brennan, the clerk, mentioned in passing that Kirkwood had left behind a second portfolio, smaller and less formally cataloged. Time equals 350 milliseconds / that contained what he called personal notes and ephemera. It had been transferred to the Department of Parks when Kirkwood briefly consulted on the design of underground storage vaults for the new Museum of Natural History. Aldrich requested a formal interdepartmental inquiry to locate the portfolio. The request was denied. The notation on the denial, signed by a deputy commissioner whose name Aldrich did not recognize, stated, "Materials described do not constitute public records and are therefore outside the purview of departmental archive access protocols." By midsummer of 1883, Aldrich had compiled his own dossier, copies of Kirkwood's photographs, annotated maps, transcriptions of the relevant correspondence, and his own field notes from multiple descents into the subterranean network. He presented his findings at the weekly engineering staff meeting on July 11th. The response was polite but dismissive. The chief engineer, a pragmatic man named Horace Grant, suggested that the photographs might depict experimental finishing techniques tested in isolated sections and later deemed impractical. The plaster, he proposed, had likely degraded from moisture exposure and been removed during routine maintenance. The lantern brackets might have been temporary installations for photographic purposes, never intended as permanent fixtures. Grant's explanation was plausible but unsatisfying. It accounted for the presence of the ornamental elements, but not for the systematic absence of any documentation explaining their purpose, installation, or removal. It also did not explain why Kirkwood's photographic survey had been curtailed by the board, or why his resignation followed so closely afterward. Aldrich did not pursue the matter further. The dossier was filed in the departmental archive under Miscellaneous Historical Surveys, a category so broad and so poorly indexed that retrieval would require knowing exactly what to look for. The photographs remained in their leather portfolio, catalogued now with a corrected inventory description: Photographic Survey of Trunk Sewer Infrastructure, Canal Street District, 1880, superseded by Revised Documentation Standards, 1883. On September 14, 1891, a construction crew excavating for the foundation of a new commercial building on Worth Street broke through into an older tunnel section that did not appear on any current map. The space was roughly circular. Time equals 350 milliseconds greater than about 20 feet in diameter, with a vaulted ceiling that rose to a central apex 12 feet above the floor. The walls were plastered and painted in a pattern of alternating blue and white panels, each framed by narrow bands of gilded trim that had tarnished to a dull bronze. In the center of the ceiling, a circular opening about 3 feet across had been sealed with a cast iron plate bolted into the masonry. The foreman, a German immigrant named Otto Schreiber, noted the details in his daily log, but made no particular fuss about them. The space was directly in the path of the planned foundation. Within 2 days, the chamber had been filled with rubble and concrete, incorporated into the building's substructure without further examination. Schreiber's log was submitted to the building inspector as part of the routine approval process. The inspector, reading quickly through a stack of similar documents, initialed the page and filed it. A marginal note in pencil, added by someone whose identity remains unknown, observed, "Decorative vault, pre-existing, origin unclear, no structural concern." The building was completed in 1892. The chamber beneath it became part of the forgotten strata of the city's layered history. Accessible only through the fragmentary record of Schreiber's log, itself buried in the archives of the Department of Buildings, indexed under a reference number that corresponded to a structure demolished in 1959. In December of 1903, during expansion work on the Lexington Avenue subway line, workers encountered a series of niches carved into the bedrock, approximately 18 feet below street level. The niches were shallow, no more than 2 feet deep, arranged in a symmetrical pattern that suggested intentional design rather than random excavation. Each niche contained remnants of plaster and, in 2 cases, fragments of painted decoration. Geometric patterns in red and ochre, faded but still discernible. The consulting engineer for the subway project, William Barclay Parsons, examined the site personally and concluded that the niches were remnants of an earlier unrecorded infrastructure project, possibly related to water supply or storage. His report recommended proceeding with excavation, noting that the niches held no structural significance and posed no obstacle to the subway construction. Time equals 650 milliseconds / the decorated plaster was photographed by the project's official documentarian, but the images were not included in the final published reports. They remained in Parsons' personal files, which were donated to the New York Public Library after his death in 1932. A researcher examining those files in 1967, a graduate student named Laura Stein working on a dissertation about 19th century urban infrastructure, noticed the photographs and attempted to cross-reference them with contemporary records. She found references to decorative subterranean elements in 3 separate archival collections: Kirkwood's 1880 survey, Schreiber's 1891 construction log, and Parsons's 1903 subway documentation. Each described similar features: plastered walls, painted designs, ornamental details, in locations that, according to official infrastructure maps, should have contained only utilitarian tunnels or raw bedrock. Stein prepared a paper proposing that a network of decorated underground chambers had existed beneath Lower Manhattan in the mid to late 19th century, possibly for purposes unrelated to water or sewage infrastructure. The paper was rejected by 2 academic journals on the grounds that the evidence was fragmentary and the hypothesis too speculative. Stein completed her dissertation on a different topic and did not return to the subject. In 1979, during renovations to the basement of the municipal building, workers removing a false ceiling discovered a small chamber that had been sealed off, probably in the 1920s. The chamber measured approximately 10 by 12 feet and featured a plastered barrel vault with a repeating pattern of raised medallions, each about 8 inches in diameter. The medallions were cast from gypsum and depicted stylized rosettes, their petals radiating from a central boss. The plaster was water-damaged and crumbling, but the pattern remained clear. A consulting architect hired to assess the discovery noted that the chamber's design was consistent with late Victorian decorative aesthetics, but utterly inconsistent with the building's known history and function. The chamber was photographed, documented in a brief report, filed with the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and then demolished to make way for updated mechanical systems. The photographs remain in the Commission's archives, filed under non-designated interior features. What emerges from these scattered records is a pattern. Underground spaces in Lower Manhattan, constructed or discovered across a span of more than 50 years, featuring decorative elements that have no obvious functional purpose and no clear documentation explaining their origin or intent. The elements themselves, plaster reliefs, painted panels, ornamental ironwork, are consistent in style and execution, suggesting a common design vocabulary or perhaps a common sponsor. Yet, no single entity claimed responsibility for their creation, and no municipal agency acknowledged their existence beyond the minimal documentation required to justify their removal or burial. The official record presents them as anomalies, aberrations, mistakes in the historical ledger that can be corrected by erasure. One possible explanation is level equals moderate greater than utilitarian concealment. Decorative treatments applied to mask the less palatable realities of urban sanitation, an attempt to dignify spaces that workers and inspectors would regularly inhabit. Victorian sensibilities often demanded that even functional infrastructure conform to aesthetic standards. Railway stations featured ornate ironwork. Water towers were disguised as medieval turrets. Bridges were adorned with sculptural elements that served no structural purpose. Extending this logic underground is not implausible. Yet the locations documented in Kirkwood's photographs and subsequent discoveries were not spaces designed for regular human occupancy. Trunk sewers were rarely entered except for emergency repairs. The chambers, discovered during subway excavation and building renovations, were not part of any known circulation system. They were isolated, hidden, accessible only by excavation or by routes that had long since been sealed or forgotten. A second explanation involves acoustic function. Plastered surfaces, especially those shaped into vaults and domes, create specific resonant properties. The niches, the medallions, the painted panels, each could serve to modulate sound, either amplifying certain frequencies or dampening others. This hypothesis is supported by measurements taken in similar spaces elsewhere. In 1889, an engineer named Émile Berliner published a study on the acoustic properties of underground chambers in European cities, noting that certain configurations of plaster and masonry could produce standing waves at frequencies perceptible as vibration rather than sound. Berliner's work focused on subway tunnels and concert halls, but his principles apply equally to sewer vaults and sealed chambers. If the decorated spaces beneath Manhattan were designed for acoustic purposes, the question becomes, for what reason, and intended to be perceived by whom? A third explanation, more speculative, suggests that the decorative elements marked spaces designated for functions that were never publicly disclosed. The pattern of their distribution, clustered in Lower Manhattan, concentrated in areas developed between 1860 and 1890, corresponds to a period of rapid, chaotic urban expansion when municipal oversight was fragmented and corruption endemic. Infrastructure projects were funded through a patchwork of public bonds, private investment, and political patronage. Time equals 600 milliseconds greater than it is conceivable that certain underground spaces were constructed for purposes unrelated to the stated goals of sanitation or transportation, storage perhaps, or clandestine meeting spaces, or experimental installations whose nature was intentionally obscured. The decorative treatments would then serve as markers, identifying these spaces to those who knew what to look for, while blending into the broader context of Victorian urban design for anyone else. No definitive answer exists in the surviving records. What remains is the physical evidence, most of it destroyed, and the photographic documentation, scattered across archives that rarely communicate with one another. Kirkwood's portfolio, the clearest and most comprehensive record, was never published, and exists now only in a handful of archival collections. Its significance recognized by a small number of researchers whose work has not substantially altered the official historical narrative. The ornamental details 15 feet underground remain a footnote, an unexplained curiosity, a minor mystery that does not fit neatly into the accepted story of how cities are built and how infrastructure functions. On a cold afternoon in November 2019, construction workers installing fiber optic conduit beneath Duane Street broke through into a small vaulted space that the engineering plans had not anticipated. The space was roughly 8 feet across, lined with brick and capped by a shallow dome. The interior surface had been plastered, and traces of paint were still visible, a repeating pattern of interlocking circles in faded blue and rust red. The site supervisor took several photographs with his phone and sent them to the project engineer, who consulted the city's geographic information system database. No record of the chamber appeared in any layer of the digital map. The supervisor was instructed to fill the void with controlled low-strength material and proceed with the conduit installation. The chamber was filled within 6 hours. The photographs were attached to a field report that was filed electronically and archived in a database that indexes construction variances by date and location, searchable only by permit number. The pattern persists, even when its purpose is forgotten. Beneath the modern city, fragments of another logic remain, embedded in the infrastructure like encrypted messages in a language no longer spoken. If history is written by those who control the records, then what is buried but not destroyed constitutes an alternate archive, one that resists interpretation but cannot be entirely erased. The photographs show what was there. The coordinates confirm the locations. The physical traces, though diminished, occasionally resurface. Yet the question of why ornamental details were placed 15 feet underground, in spaces designed to be invisible and inaccessible, remains unanswered. The official narrative moves forward, paving over contradictions, while the evidence waits, patient and silent, in the layers below.